Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Caroline. I'm always delighted to come and talk about grounded theory. I could do it for many days and often do. So the challenge this morning is going to be to get what grounded theory is, what constructivist grounded theory is, with a good old dollop of social justice and critical inquiry thrown in there as well. So thanks for the introduction, Caroline. I would like just to highlight our book, which was out last year. I've worked with Robert Thornburg for over 10 years, and we recently have a book out on constructivist grounded theory in educational research, in case anybody is interested. I would like to just highlight every session I do, and I do a lot of these internationally, I dedicate to Kathy Charmaz. I had the privilege and pleasure of being mentored by her since 2007 and working with her for many of those years as well. She's greatly missed. We lost her in 2020, and I always just like to direct people to her work. She was an incredible mentor, incredibly generous. I never really could figure out how on earth she managed to mentor so many researchers around the world. She was just an incredible person. If anyone would like to find out a little bit more about her work, you can at that link. And also remembering the brilliant and very passionate Barney Glaser, who we of course lost in 2022, along with many others in the last couple of years. So to get to my talk today, just to give you a quick overview, first of all, I've divided it into three different parts. The first is purpose, where I'm going to introduce the development, if you like, the history and development of grounded theory, where constructivist grounded theory came from. And then I want to particularly, because of our focus today, I want to look at the connection between constructivist grounded theory and social justice oriented research, with a particular look at its pragmatist roots in terms of critical inquiry, because that's very relevant to today. I'm going to look then a little bit at process. I'd like to clarify some of grounded theory's core features. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. You know, it may or may not be well known that grounded theory is probably the most cited qualitative methodology in the world. So with that popularity inevitably comes some challenges, and it is also very much interpreted mistakenly in many contexts. So there's a number of things I'd like to clear up there. So I'm going to look at core features and strategies along with some of its constructivist adaptations. But then I would like to give you some examples of how it's actually been used across the disciplines, because it's been used in some really interesting ways. And I've deliberately selected some social justice oriented studies to share with you today, and I can give you the references to follow up on afterwards. And then we will follow up or end up after looking at some challenges on a more positive note as we look towards the future of the methodology. So first of all, purpose. I know many of you here, and I know you're well aware that the purpose of grounded theory is to produce conceptualizations and theory from data. So look, grounded theory was originally developed in the 1960s by the famous US sociologists Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. They were conducting a qualitative field studies about death and dying in hospitals. So their famous book, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, that was published in 1967, was essentially the write-up of the methodology of that study, because they got pretty tired of being asked, how did you do this? This is really good work. So they wrote it up, and that was The Discovery of Grounded Theory. I'm going to say something new that I haven't actually said before at any other events, and it was really Caroline's, I think, really innovative thinking here about knowledge equity that brought this to the fore, but it's been on my mind for a while. Has anyone heard of Jean Quint Benoliel? Unfortunately, that doesn't surprise me, because she was actually the third person who developed grounded theory that nobody has ever heard of. So, and interestingly, it's even in the preface to their book about their study, Awareness of Dying, that was published in 1965. Barney and Anselm talked about Jean being the third member of our project team who provided daily invaluable support. But she's on none of the publications. So in terms of knowledge equity, that's quite interesting, isn't it? And it also reminds me, I don't know if any of you have seen The Sociologist's Wife. There's a really interesting project that took place over the last few years in the UK. Roz Edwards from Southampton, I think, and Val Gillies from the University of Westminster. They put together a really interesting documentary about the contributions, the invisible contributions of the wives of sociologists, male sociologists in the 60s and the 70s. And contribution is an interesting term there, because these women were doing the field work They weren't just typing up the manuscripts, they were doing the field work, they were doing the analysis, they were doing a lot of the conceptualisation, and they're not named as co-authors. So when we talk about knowledge equity, there's an awful lot going on here. So I thought it would be relevant just to bring that in before we go back to some of the traditional development, because these people's voices are left out in many ways, and we're well used to this, unfortunately, but it's no harm bringing it back in. So I would like to recognise Jean Quint Ben O'Leil for her contribution to the development of this methodology. So at the time, as you're all well aware, hypothetico-deductive, quantitative research kind of reigned supreme, I suppose, and the grand theories approach dominated sociology. And Glaser and Strauss were very much critical at the time of the lack of connection between the empirical world and theory. And they really wanted to address that, to kind of reignite interest in qualitative research, but also to reconnect that link, or to reconnect empirical data and theory development. But since 1967, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, grounded theory has developed into different versions. They subsequently diverged in their thinking about their approach. Strauss on his own first, and then with one of his PhD students, Juliet Corbin, who's very famous in her own right now. They further developed the method, and they introduced some new quite technical procedures which were actually quite criticised by many, not just by Glaser, by others as well, for kind of forcing the data, which is anathema to the notion of grounded theory, developing from data. And Strauss sadly died in the 90s at a young enough age, but Juliet Corbin since developed the method, and in fact, in her later versions of Straussian grounded theory, she basically has very much aligned herself with the constructivist approach, which is interesting. I know she and Kathy had some very interesting conversations in Kathy's later years. Glaser pretty much remained faithful to the original statement of the method, although he redeveloped and kind of explicated different aspects of it through his very many publications and through his very famous troubleshooting workshops that he conducted throughout the world. I was really privileged. I got to study with Glaser for a week in New York as well about 20 years ago. And that was amazing, if an interesting experience. He's an incredibly brilliant and also generous mentor of his approach. So grounded theory, however, became a very contested methodology with significant disagreement about particularly about its underlying philosophy and implications. So aspects particularly of Glaserian grounded theory, often called classic grounded theory by Glaser and his advocates. Other people call it Glaserian. There's all these different terms. But really it is criticised, I suppose, for its more positivist underpinnings philosophically, particularly because it is seen to emphasise the unbiased, detached researcher position, the rejection, essentially, of epistemology and preconception. And for many, its position on inductive emergence is seen to be really problematic, as are the more objectivist conceptions of reality. So, like right throughout Glaser's work, and even in person, he used to talk about data and patterns being latent. That if you just applied these procedures correctly, you would, hence the title, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, one would uncover these patterns simply lying in wait to be found. There is no understanding about the role of the researcher. There's no reflexivity in that regard. And I think you'd all agree, given the significant developments about our understandings about the nature of the empirical world, the nature of the social world, these sorts of beliefs have long been understood to be problematic, but they become, I think, especially and particularly so in the context of social justice-oriented research. So it was in this context then that Kathy herself, she also was was a PhD student of both Glaser and Strauss. And, she worked a lot in the nursing field, publishing a lot in her own area. But throughout the 90s, she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the epistemological basis of traditional grounded theory. So her version, it critiques and revises earlier statements of the method, and it essentially repositions grounded theory in interpretivist social science, giving it a new epistemological foundation. It's really important, and this is one myth to clear up. People often think constructivist grounded theory is a different methodology to grounded theory. It isn't. there's a huge overlap, and that's something I'll emphasize in the next section of my talk. There's a huge overlap in terms of core features and strategies. But because of its revised philosophical underpinnings, there are indeed implications for the methodology that I call adaptations, if you like. But it isn't a different methodology, and that can cause some problems in people's interpretation, I think. So this version, if you like, or this school emphasizes multiple social realities, the co-construction of our knowledge, if you like. It recognizes our researcher and participants' respective positions and subjectivities, situated knowledge, and sees data as inherently partial and problematic. So as a result, we therefore absolutely emphasize reflexivity about our starting points, our standpoints, what we bring to the research, and therefore the inevitable implications for the research process, for implementation, for interpretation, and so on. So in that way, we're very much, we understand that we are, as the researcher, the passionate participant, rather than, you know, some sort of a tabula rasa, if you like. And I think Adele Clark, Adele Clark came up with another form. Some people think situational analysis. Some people categorize it as a type of grounded theory. She was a good friend of Kathy's as well. We also lost her actually in the last couple of years, another giant of the field. But I really like her quote. She reminds us that we cannot help but come to almost any research project already knowing in some ways, already inflected, already affected, already infected. And I think that captures really, really nicely what is happening when we go into any social field. And so in constructivist grounded theory then, to use Kathy's words, we essentially view data as inherently partial, problematic and non-neutral, reflecting the positions, conditions and contingencies of their construction. So in that way, Kathy was very deliberate in her choice of word for her version of grounded theory and her books in this regard, that we construct rather than discover grounded theory. As she says, I assume neither data nor theories are discovered. We're part of the world we study and the data we collect. We construct our grounded theories through our past and present involvements and interactions with people, perspectives and research practices. My approach explicitly assumes that any theoretical rendering offers an interpretive portrayal of the studied world, not an exact picture of it. So research participants' implicit meanings, experiential views, and researchers' finished grounded theories are constructions of reality. Valid constructions, but constructions nonetheless, and that's okay. So I want to talk a little bit about then, if we start connecting it more to social justice inquiry, how does that happen? Constructivist grounded theory can be and is used in a very wide range of topics. So it isn't just a social justice methodology. So I just want to clarify that as well. It can be used in any type of research, but it is particularly well aligned to social justice oriented research. They serve mutually complementary purposes for a start. Kathy always said that grounded theory can help social justice research workers to make their work more analytic, more compelling. And at the same time, a social justice focus can help grounded theorists move their work more towards the macro analytic level. Now, Kathy's orientation to social justice research has long been evident. It was back in 2011 that she argued that constructivist grounded theory challenges positive elements that ignore reflexivity, overlook ethical issues, disregard issues of representation, and do not attend to researchers' agency in constructing and interpreting data. But over time, and I definitely saw this in conversations with her attendance to the alignment between the methodology and social justice oriented research came significantly to the fore and really occupied a lot of her thinking. And indeed, in the second edition of her famous Constructing Grounded Theory book, she boldly asked and answered, should knowledge transform practice and social processes? Yes. Can grounded theory studies contribute to a better world? Yes. Should such questions influence what we study and how we study it? Again, yes. And in fact, our orientation in constructivist grounded theory is very much aligned with the work of the famous Norman Denzin, who we also lost. It's been a bad few years. So Denzin proclaimed, and I really liked his words here, that our project is to change society, not just interpret or write about it. So like Norman, we very much in constructivist grounded theory believe in the transformational power of qualitative inquiry, including through constructivist grounded theory, but not just, in the creation of socially just societies. So we did a 2018 chapter in Denzin and Lincoln's Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, and we entitled it Evolving Grounded Theory in Social Justice Inquiry. And in that chapter, Kathy Robertson and I argued that constructivist grounded theory's revised epistemological basis befits social justice inquiry. And we considered the various tools that it offers in that domain. And we increasingly, in our works together and separately over subsequent years, increasingly focused on that close link between the methodology and social justice research, arguing that it has, really significant promise in the domain. It offers a way to connect micro, meso, and macro structures and processes. It enables us to show, not just talk about, but actually to show how processes of structural inequality and oppression are enacted in people's everyday meanings and actions, demonstrating that structure agency dynamic in action. And I've previously argued that Kathy's work not only put grounded theory on a new epistemological basis, but actually established its axiological foundation, through her focus on values, through her focus on deep and critical reflexivity and critical inquiry more generally. So Kathy always emphasised this notion, of bringing passion, curiosity and care to your work, doing something that makes a difference to the world. She was very, very strong on that. And I think that reminds us, as I said there on the slide, of the importance of increasing awareness of the conditions of our research, including what we bring to it and do with it. And as you'll see, that has become a really important part of one of the constructivist adaptations in grounded theory. Constructivism has its roots in symbolic interactionism. I saw that mentioned on your own slide, Caroline. And of course, that has its own roots in the pragmatist philosophical tradition. And a significant part of constructivist grounded theory's alignment with social justice-oriented research derives from its pragmatist philosophical heritage, and that's important, I think. And in her 2021 chapter, she argued, not for the first time, that the fit between pragmatism and constructivist grounded theory was really striking. And she identified a number of features of pragmatism that align with constructivist grounded theory. They include viewing reality as fluid and relatively indeterminate, assuming the search for multiple perspectives, seeing facts and values as co-constitutive, assuming a situated and embodied knowledge producer, and studying people's actions to solve emergent problems. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. And I forgot to start it, so that's not going to be helpful to me, so I shall ignore. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the watch instead. And of course, pragmatist philosophy, if we look at the work, for example, even of John Dewey back in the 1940s, we can see that pragmatists very much subscribe to democratic principles, questioning things like the effects of concentrations of wealth, arguing for reforming structural inequalities and taking action to solve what we would consider to be important problems in the world. They would be busy here these days. So in this context, constructivist grounded theory's social justice orientation really is unsurprising. As Kathy observed, the philosophical roots of constructivist grounded theory in the pragmatist tradition give the method a strong foundation for conducting dynamic, critical social justice studies. Constructivist grounded theory builds on pragmatist emphasis on multiple perspectives, problem solving, language and meaning, action and process, temporality, and advancing democracy, which of course is the fundamental underpinning factor of knowledge equity. And indeed, in one of her final published works on the methodology, she highlighted it as being at the forefront of critical qualitative inquiry methods. defining critical inquiry as excavating hidden meanings and actions, identifying contradictions, examining purposes, policies and practices, and evaluating the means and ends flowing to and from them. So she argued that critical inquiry addresses fundamental questions that differentiate individuals and collectivities, asking who benefits, how, when, under which conditions, and also who suffers and why, and emphasised that grounded theorists have the tools to answer such questions through empirical study. Okay. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the process of grounded theory, particularly its main features and strategies, before coming on to show you how it's been used, particularly in social justice-oriented research. So, and again, I would emphasise constructivist grounded theory is not a different methodology to grounded theory. There are some core features that underpin both, that are common to all schools. Okay, so they are that it's exploratory, iterative, inductive, abductive, comparative and systematic. So it's exploratory in that it's curious, open-ended, and it has a data-driven approach. It's iterative in that we cycle between data collection and analysis continually. One informs the other. Inductive abductive refers to the very interesting interplay between induction and abduction that is inherent in grounded theory. So through induction, we examine smaller bits of data, if you like, to interpret larger patterns. And then through abduction, we hypothesize and investigate possible relationships between aspects of our data. In terms of being comparative, we engage in what Glaser established this is from back in 1965, called the constant comparative method. Here we're constantly engaged in a process of comparing data with data, data with codes, codes with codes, codes with emerging categories. And through that process, we're able to identify different parts of our construct, essentially, different aspects of categories that subsequently become more conceptual. While being flexible, and it is flexible, but it isn't a free-for-all flexibility, it is very much systematic. There are specific guidelines about how we do all of this. So those core features are essentially enacted through a range of different strategies. You know, we start with the staged approach to data generation. We'll do our coding. We'll come up with some basic categories. We see gaps in those basic categories, and they inform what we do next in terms of going back into the field to collect more data. And that process is called theoretical sampling. It's got nothing at all to do with population representativeness. It's about identifying gaps on a conceptual level in our emerging analytic framework, and we go and get more data, whatever data is necessary to address those gaps. That's theoretical sampling. We engage in memoing, which is writing analytic notes about our data right from the start and throughout. They become progressively more abstract and more detailed. And we keep going and keep collecting more data through theoretical sampling until we reach theoretical saturation. And that's defined in a number of ways. We can look at that again if you're interested. In later stages, we can use more advanced stages of coding, like Glaser's theoretical coding, which really helps us to focus on using abstract theoretical logics to help to conceptualize relationships in our data. It's not something that's done very much, but it is actually an important part of grounded theory. I also have here some constructivist adaptations. Given what I've already said, I think the focus on critical reflexivity in researcher positionality and associated actions is probably unsurprising. But I've also identified others, things to do with the literature review, involving participants and participatory approaches, achieving what Kathy called intimate familiarity, in-depth interviewing, amongst others, some of which I will talk about in more detail. But first of all, I was always asked by PhD students and early career researchers when I was doing these workshops, I just can't see the whole thing. So I put this together, which I've since amended, but I've left it like this for today. I haven't amended it significantly. It's really just to get across that main idea that this happens in phases. So you need to know this at the beginning of if you're planning to do grounded theory. You need to allow enough time So whether a student is doing this on a part-time or full-time basis, this needs to be part of early conversations, you know, between a supervisor and a student about how they're going to plan out the different forays into the field to gather data and to do the analysis. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you know, you have the usual planning and initial literature review and so on at the start. And then I usually advise people to do a bit of data collection. It might be a certain number of observations and or interviews, but not too many. And then to engage in all of those things that we talked about with the different stages of coding, and those different stages of coding are pretty much the same, but they're called different things, just to confuse people across the different schools, but they're more or less the same. So we do all of our stages of coding, we come up with some provisional categories, and with those categories we can then see we have some gaps and we plan to go into the field to gather more data. And we essentially keep all of those key strategies going each time. So you're always memoing, you're always reviewing the literature, and you're always gathering data and analysing, and gathering data and analysing. And you could technically go on forever there, of course. And Glaser and Strauss were very clear about that grounded theory is essentially continually modifiable, that a theory can continually, we always are gathering more data to modify a theory, depending on the context and so on. But obviously, in terms of doctoral study, the supervisor needs to know how to put boundaries on this. So it's normally enough to, if we can demonstrate there has been some level of conceptualization and potentially theorization, and they're different things, we can talk about that if people are interested. But if we can demonstrate that we have, you know, some level of conceptualization amongst our categories, that's usually adequate. For getting through a Viva and for publishing and so on. So look, I won't go through that in any more detail. It's pretty much what I've said, just that staged approach is really important. So I also included, as I said there, that summary of the key constructivist adaptations. And I'm going to go through 3 now briefly, particularly in terms of their connection to social justice oriented research. So the first one is that, well, in traditional grounded theory, Glaser, of course, you may be aware, says you don't go near the literature until you've finished analysis. Now, clearly that's impractical for many people who maybe already worked in the field. So, you know, how do you forget what you know, for example? And it also, I think, underestimates researchers' ability to be reflexive. Ian Day had that famous comment, what was it? That there's a difference between an empty mind and an empty head. Or sorry, an open mind and an empty head. So, in contrast, in constructivist grounded theory, we don't pretend that it's possible or indeed preferable to come in with this open mind. Instead, we recommend doing an early and ongoing literature review to become familiar with the geography of the subject and so on. And also because this is, you know, required for most ethics applications and so forth. But at the same time, we absolutely recommend having an open mind and taking what my colleague Robert has called a theoretically agnostic and pluralistic stance. In other words, treating pre-existing theories and empirical findings as fallible, partial and provisional perspectives rather than as truths to be confirmed in a study. From a social justice perspective, this approach to the literature supports developing a critical grounded theory for consulting diverse, and I've argued about this in some publications with Kat before, including consulting the traditionally excluded grey literatures, working with community groups and others on the ground and asking them, you know, there's a lot of, you know, low level in policy speak reports that might have been developed by community groups that often tell us where we really should be starting in terms of our research foci. So a way of trying to combine those perhaps with the formal academic literature and seeing where might be, what is a good research question. So to develop, to contribute to meaningful social change, we would argue that social justice researchers must examine how and by whom earlier research has been conducted, which findings it has produced, whose perspectives are represented and whose are left out, and what recommendations have been made. So Sensitizing concepts are key concepts that may or may not prove relevant in a study. So in a grounded theory study, there may well be certain extant concepts in a field that you may feel these may be relevant in my study. So in social justice oriented research, for example, we're alert to core concepts such as power, control, inequality, oppression, etc. There's a lot. So we don't ignore these, but we are very careful about how we may or may not use them. And then really importantly, we discard what are called sensitizing concepts if they are found to be irrelevant in the study from our review of the data, okay? And where we find them to be relevant, we don't simply apply them. Instead, we evaluate and specify their usefulness. So the idea is here that you're not just going to kind of paste on, you see something in the data and the temptation is always to jump forward 3 million steps and say, oh, oppression, you know. Well, yes, the whole thing is probably about oppression. What is the specific process that is in action here? And how can we define and articulate it in such a way that it adds to our knowledge to move forward? So there's an awful lot to be thought about there. The second one I wanted to talk a little bit about, Glaser hated this. He attacked Kathy a lot about this. And I was officially excommunicated from the Classical Grounded Theory Institute once I started publishing in this domain. Yes, in original and classical grounded theory, reflexivity was just not relevant. Data were seen as unproblematic, researcher was impartial, but you know, I really like Patty Lather's quote there, which she says, our analyses of the social world are constructed and inevitably influenced by our historicality and autobiography. So, yeah, in constructivist grounded theory, deep and critical reflexivity, including about our positionality, but not only about researcher positionality, assumes central importance. So what this means in practice, and I've spent a lot of time over the last 15 years thinking about all of this, because when I found Kathy's work, I had been utterly seduced by grounded theory methodology when I was starting my PhD, but I was really uncomfortable with the philosophical basis that I was reading about. And I was like, oh, I really want to use this methodology, but it just doesn't work for me. And I was doing a social justice oriented PhD. So I was like, how can I do this? And she hadn't really been publishing that much about it at that point. So when I saw her 2006 book, I was like, yes, this is it. But even so, while the new philosophy was there, I still really didn't see, what does that mean for what I do, literally, in the field? So that's actually what I've spent a lot of time developing over time. And one of the things is, you know, it certainly isn't all that astonishing. This is done widely throughout qualitative methodology, is, you know, using, for example, journaling as critical journaling, critical analytic journaling, right from the start to journal about, you know, who we are and what we bring to the research. So our personal and professional biographies, and also to consider the provenance of the perspectives we bring to the research. So my PhD students are always horrified when I say, write down what you think about this area and what you think you're going to find. No, I don't think anything. Oh, no, I don't. I said, you do, I do, we all do. Okay, so what we actually need to do is to, and Adele Clark talks about this as well, put your cards on the table. We all have beliefs about an area. We need to actually put them down and to consider where did they come from, so that when we're analysing data, we're aware of where ourselves are perhaps intruding a little bit too much. You can never guard against it completely, nor ought we to, in my opinion, necessarily. But you do need to be conscious of it. And another thing then is to think about the implications of all of that for our research design, interpretation, research design, implementation and interpretation, because who we are has implications for all of those stages. And clearly, reflexivity is even more important in social justice oriented research, constituting essentially a key ethical issue, in fact, particularly as researcher and participants in many of our areas of study frequently hold unequal positions of power. And I will talk more about that actually later when I give you some examples. So, and one thing I do want to stress, however, because this is commonly misunderstood, that it's very important to note that by recognizing the inevitable impact of the researcher in the research process, we are not inappropriately inserting researcher perspectives into a grounded theory, right? That would go against grounded theory's fundamentally emergent nature. So the point I'm making is by acknowledging that data are co-constructed, we're simply recognizing and admitting that it inevitably happens. But we do not deliberately impose meanings, any meanings we wish on the emerging analysis. In fact, it really helps us to be much more careful about all of that. So from a constructivist perspective then, the idea is we need to remember we all bring beliefs and biases to our research. The key thing is to unearth, acknowledge and be aware of them at the outset and throughout. And indeed, Kathy, and people didn't seem to pick up on this at all, but she said it herself back in 2014. She said, by laying our cards on the table, essentially as researchers, we become aware of how and to what extent we draw on these assumptions and perspectives. And we then must, and this was said very clearly, be willing to revise or relinquish them should our interpretations of the data so indicate. So this is not a constructivist free-for-all. And I'll have to just keep jumping up and down about that everywhere I go, because it is a really fundamental misunderstanding of the constructivist approach. Okay, the third adaptation that we'll look at, I'm not looking at everything today, there isn't time, but briefly, because it's relevant to today's discussion, is that because we understand that we co-construct our analyses, it makes sense to think about how we could meaningfully involve our participants. So working to deliberately, and I say meaningfully very deliberately, meaningfully involve our participants in the research process, it very nicely aligns with constructivist but also pragmatist democratic principles. So examples of this in practice, you'd be probably more familiar with this in your fields than even has been done to date in education, but involving participants actively in data production, as well as during analysis in different ways. There's lots of ways this can be done, and it is challenging. I remember Michelle Miller writing about this about 25 years ago, actually, a really nice paper. Can't remember the co-author, sorry, it escapes me. So evidently in social justice oriented research, which is often situated, of course, in the transformative paradigm, participatory principles are very often invoked. So researching with rather than on participants assumes particular importance, as we need to make specific and ongoing efforts to address those power differentials between ourselves as researcher and our participants. The idea is that we want to ensure that the developed grounded theory resonates with and is useful for the specific community. So here our emphasis is on building rapport, building trust and building opportunities for reciprocity. And I know that links very nicely as well with the principles of Ubuntu that I'll come on to shortly. So our motivation here is to avoid the traditional colonization approach that has underpinned research in academia for a long time, and instead to create a more democratized research process. Okay, so I want to just give you some examples about how constructivist grounded theory is being used in social justice oriented research across the disciplines. It's being widely used. Sorry, the font is changing on some of the slides. I was saying that to Caroline earlier. It's fine. So there's different examples here. You can see from education right down to criminal justice. Constructivist grounded theory has been used to varying different extents. There are some examples here. I'm sure the slides will be shared with you afterwards, so we can give you those specific references if you're interested, from psychology, sociology, social work and nursing. And they're particularly famous studies in terms of their good application of the methodology. I wanted to pick three to go into. I wanted to look at some of my own from education first, and then two others. So in educational research, so my work has been mostly about social class, access to higher education and the professions, teacher diversity over the last 20 or so years, and all of my work really has had a social justice orientation, and it's been really important to me to recognise the power differentials that were there on different levels with participants. So along with using all of the core strategies of grounded theory, I was very much focused on developing constructivist adaptations, if you like. So in one study about the university of experiences of students from different social class backgrounds, I prioritized rapport, trust and reciprocity building to support the development of that intimate familiarity that Kathy talked about. So these processes underpin quality data generation, but are very much also part of an ethical grounded theory practice. I also prioritised critical reflexivity about my own personal and professional positionality, journaling throughout, and then using those writings to create what I called a critical autobiographical statement for inclusion in publications. I also then, at the time I talked about it as hijacking, but essentially used theoretical sampling stages to share the emerging analytic framework with participants in particular ways to get them involved in the process, to recognise, I suppose, that fundamentally co-constructive nature of constructivist grounded theory. And I also use those same procedures in more recent research that I conducted with student teachers from working class backgrounds in the context of diversifying the teaching profession. But here I also developed a strategy that I called positionality sharing or researcher self-disclosure, which I think is relevant for knowledge equity. So in this study, I was researcher, but I was also the participants' actual lecturer, which obviously produced a whole range of complications and implications, particularly in terms of my participants' vulnerabilities. So at the outset of data generation, I explained my interest in the area, and I offered them quite a bit of information about my own background, and I've published a paper about this where you can really see my own discomfort and how I was dealing with that. This can be difficult to do, you know. They talked about, and I asked them as well about the impact of that on them and how that made them feel. And, you know, okay, they may have just said this anyway. There's always that interviewer pleasing effect that goes on, of course. But they did say to me, no, after that, I felt you got it. And I felt more comfortable in sharing X, Y, and Z with you. Now, of course, that can also be manipulated. So to what extent is that an equitable practice? It depends on the motivation of the researcher. So it's all complicated. Nothing in this area is simple. And I think there's pros and cons to it as well that really have to be considered. And there's a little bit published about it in different fields. So I can share that with you again, that notion of researcher self-disclosure. But yeah, these different and separate constructivist grounded theory studies that I did produced conceptualizations of students' experiences of what I called distancing to self-protect for the university students, and chameleoning to fit in for the student teachers in their placement schools. And both of these, you can read up on them if you're interested, they revealed the very strong mediating effect of social class, particularly on the socio-relational experiences of these students within middle-class organisations, but also revealed the underpinning motivations for their actions and reactions and behaviours in these domains. For anyone interested in educational research, there's tons more examples in our handbook. But I want to briefly look at two more with you. One is from psychology. This is from a really interesting constructivist grounded theory study with counselling psychologists in the US, Arksinski and Morrow. They looked at the complexities of power in feminist, multicultural, social justice-oriented psychotherapy supervision. So as well as using all the core grounded theory procedures, their study really nicely exemplifies constructivist principles in action. They explicitly attended to their positionalities, noting that they themselves constituted instruments in their research. In their publications, they identify aspects of their positionalities, explaining how, after every interview they conducted, they traced their own and the participants' past experiences, social locations, theoretical premises, as well as how the nature of the research shaped our interactions. There isn't very often an explicit acknowledgement of that. So that was really good to see. as well as the journal they used to record all of this, they discussed it with colleagues and were challenged on some aspects of it. And that is becoming something we're seeing in the methodological literature. They're also explicit about how they treated related concepts in their work, emphasizing their desire to conduct a rigorous and credible analysis that was authentic to participants' lived realities. So they were very conscious of that. They took a participatory approach to the development of their emerging framework, engaging in bi-weekly debriefing sessions with colleagues and some participants, and conducting follow-up interviews and peer debriefing sessions with participants. So they identified a core and subcategories demonstrating how their participants conceptualize the complexities of power in supervisory relationships and the strategies that were employed to anticipate and manage power in reconfiguring good supervision practices. Really interesting paper if you're interested in following up. And the last example I want to share with you, this was the paper I talked to you about, Caroline, a while back, from Schreiber and Tom Bond in Canada. So this is their 2015 paper. They've published a lot of different papers. In this particular paper, they focus on methodology. But here they talk about how in their CGT studies, their constructivist grounded theory studies, on topics like how women manage their lives in the context of HIV/AIDS, how women created a non-cash food economy, topics like that. They moved beyond constructivism to incorporate a culturally appropriate methodology underpinned by a transformative philosophy. This paper is really interesting and I think is very much at the edge between our areas and very nicely connects the two, actually, Tanya. So they're writing about their work as Western nursing researchers conducting investigations in Mozambique, and they discuss the challenges. They discuss their decision to use the South African philosophy of Ubuntu as an appropriate ontology to guide their constructivist grounded theory study implementation. They argue that they're very much congruent, and I think they are, highlighting what they call a number of areas of correspondence. There's a whole range of them, but they center on reciprocity, reflexivity, and a commitment to social justice. So again, they used all of the core features, and that's the thing. I think sometimes when people see constructivist grounded theory, they think it's only about these adaptations. It's not. To do a constructivist grounded theory study, you need to do the core stuff as well. And you can read about those in their other papers. But this paper is about how they applied these principles in the field. And they did a number of different things here. Reflexive practice through journaling and discussion, not just with each other and other colleagues, but also with their participants. And that really does open it up. Sharing resources, providing small gifts, providing feedback on a funding proposal, actually, that their participants were working on in the field. And really working to emphasise egalitarian relationships and reciprocity in a variety of ways, including participating in a way they didn't expect in a song and dance ritual and for which they were completely unprepared. I thought their honesty there was good, but that's reciprocity in action. So they end by emphasising the alignment, and I think this is really interesting, between Ubuntu philosophy and constructivist grounded theory and its potential, or indeed promise, as a starting point for anti-oppressive research that privileges the voice of the global south. So all of these studies are excellent examples of constructivist grounded theory in practice, both in terms of the core processes of the methodology and its constructivist adaptations. You okay for 5 minutes, Caroline? Yep. Okay, so just to finish up the last section, I mentioned earlier that grounded theory is I think since the 1960s, Janice Morse has said this, another one of that second generation who studied with Glaser and Strauss, has become, the most cited qualitative methodology in the world. And certainly we saw that, in the hundreds of papers that Robert and I would have reviewed over the years, including for our handbook. It's constantly cited And sometimes you don't have to go very far even into the abstract to realise this is not grounded theory. And it's a real problem for the methodology, because it does give it a bad name. You open it up and you realise there's nothing to do with grounded. I'm not sure what it is, and maybe it's still a really good study. Doesn't mean it's a bad study, but it just is not grounded theory in many, many cases. So that's a real challenge for the methodology, I have to say. And Janice Morse and her colleagues, who was including Kathy at the time, emphasised the need for a return to grounded theory's core perspective as a mode of conceptualising human behaviour and how to focus on action and change. So they're in their final chapter in that second edition. They really express a lot of concern about the diminishment in quality of studies that purport to have used grounded theory. And as I said, we found very much the same. So, you know, what we see all of the time is a lot of understanding about the sorts of things that I've shared with you, but also things like, inadequate data collection. Tiny samples, not doing that iterative approach where you do some data collection and analysis and then more data collection and analysis. Still, people are doing a whole pile of data collection and then sitting down going, now what do I do, right? And also not producing any level of conceptual or theoretical development. And that is really, really a problem. So, you know, I always, when people say to me, I want to do a PhD using grounded theory, I'm like, do you? Do you? Do you really? Let's talk about what that is, okay? Let's talk about what theory is, what that, and also what it isn't, because theory can sound like a very scary thing to develop. So we bring it down to what is actually expected. But, you know, often really, when we talk through what somebody really wants to do, it isn't that they want to do grounded theory. They want to do something more along the lines maybe of phenomenology or ethnography, and all of those are fantastic methodologies. So it just depends on the purpose. So I think we just need to be clear, perhaps, about what is the most suitable methodology for the research question I have in mind. And that may be quant as well. There's nothing wrong with quant. There's a place for everything. It depends on the research question. So we certainly recommend that researchers considering grounded theory read what the originators wrote about it, and fundamentally decide whether they wish to develop some level of conceptualization. If they don't, you shouldn't be doing grounded theory. However, and this is a big point of clarification that both Robert and I know Kathy agreed with this as well, that we make in the field. I think one of the reasons a lot of people cite grounded theory is they're attracted by its systematicity and the fact that there are guidelines, and you know it seems to look good, if you like. And in the absence sometimes of adequate mentorship and supervision, people jump onto the train essentially. So one of the things I always tell people is, look, the procedures in grounded theory are also actually very powerful. Like the specific coding stages, particularly coding with gerunds, the verbal nouns that help us focus on action and process in our data, they're actually really cool and really powerful. So I understand always why people are attracted to them. But I say to people, you can do that. Just don't call your study grounded theory. Don't say you used grounded theory. Say instead that you used some grounded theory coding techniques, and then explain your wider methodology. And just make sure it aligns as well, And I think that gives people enormous freedom then. You can still do bits of it, but you didn't do grounded theory, nor did you produce a grounded theory. And I think that makes it a more democratic approach as well. There are quite a few purists in the field that say, no, you can't do that. Glaser certainly felt you absolutely couldn't do that. But I think as long as you're clear about what you're doing and not doing, that it's fine to do. The other problem that we have seen in the field is that, yes, for people saying I did CGT, constructivist grounded theory, my question was often, well, what did you do to make it constructivist? You can't just say I believe in this stuff, but what did you actually do? So show me what journaling you did. Show me what you did with those entries. What implications did that have for how you gathered your data, for how you interacted with your participants? What dilemmas did that pose for you as the analyst with your data in interpretation? So you need to spell out what you did to make it constructivist. And a final challenge that I see is that people then do tend to fall in, some people fall into that tendency to say it's the free for all. If it's constructivist, I can do whatever I want because they said it's flexible, right? It is flexible, but within parameters. So you need the core features and you need some constructivist adaptations, and then how that works can certainly be negotiated. But we do need both. You need the core features and the constructivist adaptations. So briefly just looking to the future, the field, you're probably aware, has been really divided in the past. So it's been very exciting the last few years. I'm on the steering committee of the International Association of Grounded Theorists. We've had 2 really successful international conferences over the last 5 years. And here for the first time, we've people from Glazer's Institute and all the other schools working together. So it's interesting that this has happened since we've lost the greats in the field. I don't know, maybe it would have happened before. But it's a really important development. Like, we obviously greatly mourn the loss of Kathy, Barney and Anselm and others. But yeah, as the grounded theory people of the present, we've come together to chart a more united methodological future. So we're working on a joint publication at the moment, which is interesting, where we're trying to agree on what we agree on and disagree on. So that's really interesting. But look, there's great power, I think, and potential in unification, as Stuart Hall, I think it was, who observed there can be unity in difference. So we're working towards it. Also, you know, Robert and I are deeply honoured to be working on the next edition of Kathy's Constructing Grounded Theory for SAGE. And one of the things we're definitely bringing forward in that is the social justice orientation much more strongly. And I think there's huge potential for further aligning the methodology with social justice and transformative research into the future, as we seek, in Norman's words, to change society, not just interpret, you know, or write about it. So in this way then, I'm really interested in the talk this afternoon and thinking about how we can further integrate aspects of decolonising methodologies, because I really do think that's where it's going next. Participatory approaches, yes, critical reflexivity, etc., into grounded theory, while simultaneously producing high quality, impactful conceptual analyses that hold meaning for our participants and their communities. And really help us to fulfill Kathy's vision of grounded theory as a methodology for social justice research that will, in her words, make a real difference to the world. So that's it. Thank you.